Good morning, Mr. Arlinghouse. Cheers to you. Once again, coke is the primary component in making steel. What are the other two, Mr. Arlinghouse? That's right, iron and limestone. And Mr. Arlinghouse can tell you, being an expert on the Pittsburgh Steelers, that's what those three diamonds stand for on the side of the Pittsburgh Steelers helmets, which are right now doing nothing. I would like to put out a friendly reminder again that you all owe me a DBQ and I expect payment. And that DBQ has a due date of the 25th, which I'm not moving. So, and the DBQ doesn't have a time limit. In other words, when you start doing it, you can do it, come back to it, ask people questions, ask me questions, but that won't be normal. So yes, let's get to that. And I hope everybody enjoys my picture here. We don't really need to see me, do we? This is my new car. You like that, Mr. Arlinghouse? I think you could put your whole family in there. This is called a Treblinka. It's the standard issue automobile of the Soviet Union and their bloc states post World War II. Now you're saying, where did you find this beauty? Budapest, Hungary. I was there in 2018. A lovely little city. Budapest is the easternmost western city and the westernmost eastern city. I mean, it's a different kind of place, and it was a pleasant surprise. A lot of beautiful things to see in Budapest. Not only that, let me recommend to you, Mr. Arlinghouse, the Hungarian goulash. It's a nice soup. It's a nice soup that I'll look at that later. That's very, very tasty. Yes. But I showed you this because it has to do with the Industrial Revolution, and because, Mr. Arlinghouse might want to buy this from me. So, back to the matter at hand. Let's begin. Today we're talking about economics of the industrial age. Once again, going back to that LEQ, or LEQs about this period of time, the Industrial Revolution is often a subject matter of DBQs, LEQs. And because the Industrial Revolution, once again, was the single most important event of the last 1,000 years. But the reason why it's important is because it brought so many changes. And one of them, those changes, is in economics. Now, I'm sure that you all recall this guy, Adam Smith. Adam Smith was a Scottish person who lived during the Enlightenment and came up with a scientific examination of economics. Basically, the idea that you should let the powers of the marketplace just work their will, that the government shouldn't interfere at all in business. Remember, it's called laissez-faire, which means let it alone, let be. The government should keep their hands out of business, which is a nice idea. And it is the way people make money, and how a society has prosperity for people. But here's the thing about laissez-faire economics. Yes, you can win. Yes, you can make money. But also, yes, you can be completely destitute. I mean, I would think that driving around our larger cities in particular, you can see evidence of that. And, we are a country that prides itself as having the highest standard of living in the world. And yet, once again, you drive around the larger cities and you see a significant population of people who, are indigent. And part of that rests with capitalism. Because once again, capitalism, there's a possibility you could become wealthy and a possibility that you could become destitute. So, economists whose thought derived largely, sorry, from Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. That's his book. You guys, I was yelling at the other day for not knowing who Adam Smith was. And, this is not the first time I mentioned his name. He's a very important figure, not just in Enlightenment, but in the ideas of economics. He wrote the Bible. The Wealth of Nations is the Bible of capitalist economics. If you, and I know a number of you will, because, for example, at UK, most of the student body who go to UK in their freshman year say, "Oh, I'm going to major in a health field. I'm going to be a nurse or a doctor or something like that," and that's wonderful. And by their second year, they're in business. Business is the largest department at the University of Kentucky, and I'm telling you, a lot of those guys shift from the chemistries, the sciences, the maths, the health careers, and they find themselves in business. Or, and that's not to say that business is a bad thing or business is easy. They just say, I'm going to go this way, which happens a lot of times. But if that should happen to you, and it does for many people, I'll guarantee you that within your first year or so that your teachers, your instructors, will have you become familiar with Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. It's basic. So, economists of the industrial age who had read Adam Smith, their thought dominated private and public opinion about economics. Their ideas have most often been associated with, once again, there's the word, laissez-faire economics. Competitive growth through free competition with little government interference. They envisioned a society of business competitors who would supply the needs of the society through free competition. The government's job under such a situation is to maintain a currency, enforce contracts. When two people or two parties say they're going to do something, then laissez-faire says it's the government's job to make sure that contract gets carried out or somebody gets compensated. Protect property, impose low tariffs. And I'm sure you, Mr. Arlinghouse, and the rest of you all know a tariff is a tax on imports, goods coming into the country. Impose low tariffs and taxes and just leave the rest of the competitors. Now, once again, all that's a great idea. Except, once again, and we talked about this before, job number one of business is to make money. It is not to make a good product. It is not to treat its workers properly. It is not to be moral. It is not to take care of the environment. None of those things. But, you may be saying, but those things happen. And Adam Smith will tell you, well, those things will happen. No, they won't. And they haven't. I mean, the 19th century should show us that. The 19th century in the United States of America, the so-called, and you'll learn about this next year in AP US, or even in regular US, the so-called Gilded Age, pardon me, the Gilded Age were the great majority, and by great majority, I mean, well, for example, here's a stat for you that you do not have to remember, but it's interesting, and it proves my point. Prior to the Great Depression of 1929, during the so-called Roaring Twenties, that where everybody said, "Oh, prosperity's good," and things are going through the roof. During the Roaring Twenties, 70% of the population of the United States of America in 1929, prior to the Great Depression, 70% of the population lived below the poverty line. And, they thought that was prosperity. And, why do they live below the poverty line? Well, because a small fraction of the population of this country lived above the poverty line. Are you saying, well, Mr. Horton, how many people live below the poverty line today? I think the numbers are around 10%, maybe. Mr. Arlinghouse could contradict me on that or get out his phone. Pardon me, Mr. Arlinghouse. Get out his phone, which he's been using to text all his buddies. And wow them with his acumen about the Industrial Revolution. But he'd get out his phone and check those facts for me. Yeah, about 10%, I think, live below the poverty line today. So, I mean, depending on business to regulate itself wholly and entirely, you're going to have a whole lot of people who live in a decrepit state. And that's what happens because business, yes, business is good, but also business is self-centered. But anyway, the economists of the 19th century Industrial Revolution, they were all laissez-faire economists. They felt that business should be allowed to run. From that, we're gonna get into this thing called social Darwinism, where people believe that the strongest survive, not just in the animal world, but in the business world. And, not everybody can survive, they say. All right, classical economists like Thomas Malthus, whose name you better remember, and David Ricardo. Lucy, I'm home. Right, Mr. Arlinghouse? Like Thomas Malthus, felt that the working class could not be helped or trusted significantly. And I mean, see, I want you to get it into that. They didn't feel, not only did they feel that you couldn't help the working class, they didn't think you could trust the working class. You need to look and understand, Mr. Arlinghouse, what is the underlying assumption there? The underlying assumption is that the great majority of the people, they used to refer to them as the unwashed masses, meaning that these people are of lower intelligence. These people are not quite as human, and that business has proved this out. That business is the great training ground, the great proving ground. Some people do okay in business, but the rest, not so much. Malthus' first essay was Essay on the Principle of Population. Well, if he's going to die, then let him do it and decrease the surplus population. That's Thomas Malthus. Yes, my good friend Charles Dickens, and my favorite story, A Christmas Carol, when Ebenezer Scrooge is confronted by those two guys soliciting charity, and he is told that, many of the poor would rather die than go to the workhouses. And Scrooge just shoots back, well, if they're going to die, then let them do it and decrease the surplus population. He was quoting Thomas Malthus, a person that obviously Dickens didn't have a lot of sympathy with. But yeah, he was quoting Thomas Malthus. And that idea that if they're going to die, let them do it and decrease the surplus population was a rather popular idea amongst the intellectual and business elite of the industrial age. Okay? So, he contended that population would always outstrip the food supply because the food supply could only grow arithmetically. The human population, let me fix this, would grow exponentially. That's better. You say, well, what does that mean, Mr. Horton? I'm not a mathematician. Mr. Arlinghouse is, though, right? Mr. Arlinghouse just texted me the answer. What it means is the food supply could only grow arithmetically. That means that as of then, the best way to produce more food was to bring more land under cultivation. More land under cultivation means more food production. But there's a limit to that. And the human population grows exponentially, meaning that the human population, and this is happening, the human population is growing at the human population is increasing at an increasing rate. How's that, Mr. Allinghouse? The human population is increasing at an increasing rate, meaning it's taken a shorter and shorter amount of time for the number of human beings to occupy this planet to double. There was little hope, according to Malthus, of avoiding a world disaster. He felt late marriage, chastity, and contraception only could save the population. Malthus contended the plight of the working class could only get worse. He's basically like, there's no hope, because Malthus says if you raise the wages of the working class, the poor will just have more children, because that's what they do. Those children would then only demand higher raises, higher increases in salary. And have more children, and very pessimistic. David Ricardo, then, a follower of Malthus, in his Principles of Political Economy, came up with the iron law of wages, and that is what he is known for. He says, if you raise the wages, you have more children. More children in the workforce equal lower wages. Lower wages equal less children and less people in the workforce. He said that wages would always tend towards a minimum level. This idea supported the employers in their tendencies not to raise the wages. And so, yeah. If you notice, both these men, Malthus and David Ricardo, were not very supportive of the plight of the lower classes. All right, Roman numeral 19. The working class, of course, hated the attitudes of the classical economists like Adam Smith, and Thomas Malthus, and David Ricardo, but governments loved them. Louis Philippe, he was the finance minister of the last Bourbon king. No, I'm sorry, Louis Philippe was the last Bourbon king. Louis Philippe was the Duke of Orleans, and his finance minister, Francois Guizot. Francois Guizot, at one point in time in his career, had been asked, what about all the people who want to vote? His famous quote was that, well, if the people of France want to vote, they can vote. And it's simple. All they have to do is get rich. If you get rich, you can vote. And so, yeah, that didn't go over too well. The July monarchy of Louis Philippe saw the construction of major domestic projects across France. In 1834, all the major German states except Austria formed something called Der Zollverein. I should put D-E-R. That will impress Herr Zeigler, D-E-R. Der Zollverein, or Free Trading Union. And you say, what is that? Now, it's on your test, by the way. Der Zollverein was an agreement amongst all the German states except Austria. And remember, there are a lot of German states. At one time there were 300 of them. And in 1834, I don't know how many there were. But Bavaria, Baden, Hanover, of course, Prussia, Schleswig, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And, those states traded with each other and shipped products across each other's borders. Well, the Zollverein was simply an agreement amongst all those German states that when the goods of one of the German states crossed their boundary, that they would not charge a tariff, a toll. I mean, in fact, those of you who take German know that the word Zollverein, Zoll means tax, Verein means free. Right? Easy to remember. Free trade. Classical economists had less influence in Germany because of the tradition dating back from enlightened absolutism of the state direction of economic development. You say, what does that mean, Mr. Horton? Well, the Germans were quite accustomed to being told what to produce by their monarchs. That's it. Yeah. Frederick List argued for this approach to economic growth. Now, let's get into some names. Jeremy Bentham, a utilitarian, sought to create codes of scientific law that were founded upon the principles of utility. And what is a utilitarian? And look, Mr. Horton gave you the answer. Utilitarianism is the idea that you should do what creates the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. He wrote the book Fragment on Government and Principles of Morals and Legislations. Bentham's followers were the proponents of England's Poor Law, which was passed in the latter part of the 18th century. The Poor Law, and you need to make some, definition somewhere of the England's Poor Law, not just for what it was, but also for its significance. The English Poor Law was the first time in history of this planet where the government of a country said, you know what, it is our job to be concerned about the welfare of our citizens. And back up that and look at that, the significance of that. Right now in our Congress, they're going to be talking about sending everybody a check, all taxpayers a check for $1,400. Why? Because we're going through, this pandemic and there's large unemployment, and sending everyone a check for $1,400. People in this time would have been aghast, would have laughed at such an idea. But that's how far these things have come. And the English Poor Law, once again, is the first time that a government said, you know what, it is the job of government to look after the welfare of the people. Before that, governments, they didn't see that was their job. I mean, their job was to protect them from enemies, foreign and domestic, meaning invading armies, but after that, no. But here England is with this poor law, which came to be hated on many accounts, hated by the people who had to pay the taxes, one, but also kind of resented by the poor because basically they got thrown into poorhouses. So let's look at it. Which was supposed to care for the poor, actually was hard on the poor. They established a Poor Law Commission, but it was to make poverty the most undesirable of all conditions. You see, here was their goal. Okay, we're going to help you get out of poverty. And what our strategy is going to be, we're going to make it, I don't want to use any bad word, but we're going to make it, you not like it. We're going to make you not like what we're going to do for you so much that you will fix yourself. We're going to put you in these poorhouses, and yeah, you'll get something to eat. Yeah, you'll have a place to sleep that's not in the rain, but the food's going to be terrible, and the place to sleep is going to be on a concrete floor with straw, and you are going to get beaten, and your children are going to get beaten, and you're going to work every day and work hard so that you want to get out of poverty. As it says there, life in the poorhouses was purposely designed to be more harsh than life on the outside of the poorhouses. Husbands and wives separated, children abused, and the food was bad and the work very distasteful. There was also the stigma of the workhouse, meaning that, you get sent to the workhouse, everybody knows that, you can't take care of yourself. The stigma of being in the workhouse. That's why in Dickens' Christmas Carol, many would rather die than go there. The second monument to British applied classical economics was the repeal of the Corn Laws of 1848. Important piece of legislation. Now, a few weeks ago, we learned about the Corn Laws. Please tell me you haven't forgotten that. The Corn Laws, once again, were a protective tariff tax placed on imported grain coming into Britain. And the purpose of it was to make sure that your average Joe would not buy grain imported outside of England. But for your average Joe, it greatly raised their price of bread. And, the poor hated the Corn Laws, hated them, because in the end it made their bread more expensive. And in the end it made the rich people in England richer because you bought their stuff. This was to lower the price of grain and therefore of food. The actual cause of this repeal was the good old Irish potato famine of 1847, and that the British needed to import grain more freely so they could feed the starving Irish, which they did, even though still 1 million Irish people died in that year of starvation-related illnesses. However, the repeal of the Corn Law marked the opening of an era of free trade that continued in the late 19th century. Saying, I don't get it, Mr. Horton, what does that mean? Well, there's many cool things about Britain being an island, defense-wise. However, there's also something bad about it, and that is this, that by committing to free trade of grain, that meant the British would always be dependent upon grain coming into their country. How? By train? Flying? No. They put it in boats on the ocean and then ship it in. Well, ships like that can be blockaded, can be sunk. And so what the British had to do, and this is the important part where it says, Mr. Arlinghouse, and the British Navy, the British at this point will make a commitment that their Navy will always be strong enough to overwhelm, to defeat any potential two adversaries. Yeah, and so that means the British Navy has to be big. That means the British Navy has to be modern. And that means the British Navy is going to be expensive. And so, yeah, that's the importance of the repeal of the Corn Laws of 1848. It committed Britain to a policy of free trade. And because of that free trade, Britain had to feed itself to maintain that free trade. And to be able to maintain that free trade, the British had to have a navy that could protect that free trade. A navy that was stronger than any two potential adversaries. And in the latter part of the 19th century, we would get into these iron warships and, bigger guns and more expensive ships and those kind of things. And so, yeah. Okay. We're going to start talking about socialism tomorrow. That word everybody gets all jumpy about, socialism. Okay? I think that's good for today, don't you, Mr. Arlinghouse? And I'll see you.